I am not an expert in marketing, but it seems to me like one of the best ways to do marketing is to get people to want what other people have. And whether you stir up some social media buzz that is what gets people excited about something, or you find a famous person to go first that then other people can follow on, if you can get that buzz going where people want what other people have, right? Now your marketing has gotten a lot easier. I think of, we used to live in the panhandle of Florida, and there was this great little restaurant that somebody that I worked with found, and we would all go. It was called the Red Bar and Piccolo Restaurant. It was on the beach in this little kind of ramshackle old building. It was wonderful. These old kind of dusty couches, all the lights in the place were red. They'd bring you a menu on a big chalkboard. And then Peyton Manning went there, and then you couldn't go there anymore because you could never get a table, right? Because all of a sudden, people wanted to go to this place that he had been. Likewise, when we lived in St. Louis, a little restaurant called the Iron Barley opened up near us. It was fantastic. The first time we went, they didn't have their whole liquor license yet, so they were serving people alcohol out of one of those creaky coolers, like that goes every time you open it and then close it. It was that new. And it was awesome, and you would never find it if you didn't know it was there, because it was in like the basement of an old house on a side street you would never drive down. Until it was on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives, I think it was, and then you couldn't go there anymore because it was always busy, right? Because people want what other people have, and then really it's a form of imitation. And we as people, I think, are in many ways, even just for survival, driven by imitation. It is in imitating others that we really make our way through a lot of life. If you think about little babies, like we're going to have a baptism today, he is going to learn how to talk and walk and do all kinds of things by watching someone else and thinking, I can do that. I learned how to read in, I think, kindergarten or first grade. My brother was 4, and he was like, I can do that. So he taught himself how to do those things, right? Imitating the things that I was learning and imitating me. There's even things, I even just think about like prehistoric people, right? When they were out just trying to survive. If someone ate berries that killed them and someone else ate berries that didn't, you would imitate the one that didn't just as a matter of survival. But as we live in our modern times, if you get a new job, hopefully there's someone there that you can follow and imitate, or there's processes and procedures that help you to make sense of what it is you're supposed to be doing in an imitating kind of way. And you know we're good at imitation because we have to have laws to stop us from imitating things sometimes, right? Copyrights, trademarks, patents, all those things exist because when someone comes up with a new idea and starts making money off it, everybody else goes, well, I can do that, right? And so we get to these spaces of imitation. Now, in the many ways that imitation is good for us, it can also be bad. A really terrible example is copycat crimes, when there are those people who see someone do something terrible and then think, yes, I'm going to do that same thing. On a less intense level, children often won't come up with a bad idea on their own, but are perfectly happy to imitate someone else's. That's peer pressure, right? And adults are not immune to it. And then you get other ways that we are imitative. I think if you look at much of the division and the divisiveness in our culture, a lot of it is people that are just saying the things that they saw someone else say on the news on either side and repeating that without doing whole lots of deep thoughtfulness yourself. If I could take the share button off of Facebook and other social media where you can just share something somebody else said, I would, because it would force people to have to think through their own way of saying things instead of just continuing to mimic and imitate things. We are imitating sort of creatures. That's what we do. Now, Paul knew this, and so in the passage we hear today from Philippians, Paul says, imitate me and the other people that are living, he doesn't say it just this way, but really imitate those of us who are trying to walk in the way of Jesus. And then he gives some other options. You can either imitate us, or you can be an enemy of the cross. Now, that's some pretty strong language. And he gives some options. He says, you can imitate us or be an enemy of the cross. And those are the kind of people whose God is their belly, meaning are just driven by their physical needs and wants and desires. Or, he says, they're people who are always thinking about earthly things. And so Paul seems to be saying, you can either imitate me, you can either imitate somebody else. But deep underneath this, it's not so much a mimicking kind of imitation. I don't know if any of you did this to your siblings, but like if my brother went like this, sometimes I would go like this, and then he'd go like that, and I'd go like that, and he'd look at me, and then I'd look at him, and then he'd say what? Stop, and then I would say, stop, and then he'd say, Mom, make him stop, and then I would say, right? That's the kind of imitating where you're exactly imitating something. That's not what Paul is telling us to do. And we can't exactly imitate Paul because he lived in an entirely different time. The imitating that Paul is talking about is really a question of who are we being obedient to? Are we trying to be obedient to the call of Jesus to love and serve our neighbor? Or are we following some other way and imitating some other path? Paul also uses the language of citizenship. He was a Roman citizen who happened to be in jail when he wrote this. He would have had as many opportunities and blessings as anybody, but he's writing to people who probably didn't, and he reminds them that their citizenship is in heaven, not in this place. All of it is his way of saying, we can follow Jesus, or we can follow these other ways of being. And as he's inviting people to think about that is where he gets to this thing of saying, these are the people that are enemies of the cross. And that is strong language. But there's an important thing to remember in what Paul says here. It sounds judgmental to call them enemies of the cross, but he ultimately says, I'm not saying that, he doesn't say the word judgment. He just says, I say this with tears. Meaning that Paul is sad. Even as he's in jail for his faith, he is sad for people who have not encountered Jesus and found that following the call of Jesus is a path to freedom and to life. He's not judging the enemies of the cross. He's sad for them that they don't have what he has. Right? So I said marketing is trying to get people to want what other people have. Paul wants other people to have what he has. Right? The invitation to imitate me, as Paul says it, or to follow those who live in the way of Jesus, is his way of saying, I want you to know what freedom looks like, what grace looks like, what love looks like, because I've experienced that. And the fact that he's saying it from jail is all the more compelling because he's locked up, but he still feels free. So his sadness for others is that they have imitated, they have followed, they have lived as citizens of the world, not lived into the gift of grace that we have in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this is his invitation for other people to have what he has. And I have had the flip side of that longing to want what other people have when it comes to faith. The one that immediately came to mind to me was the woman who had gotten the news that she was dying from cancer. She had been getting treated for a long time and finally decided to stop treatment. And yet, she came to the table on a Sunday with her head held high, joy on her face, and her hands held out. And I remember thinking, man, I want that. I want that kind of faith and joy. I want to feel free like she feels free. And I've encountered people of faith all along, and the ones that have really made me want to say, I want that, always seem to have a sense of peace. They always seem to have wisdom that, you can't figure out, but then they say something and you go, yeah. And they have a presence about them. And I always, after a while, figure out that they've, and I'm saying this carefully, earned that presence. And what I don't mean that they have been so good at suffering and working through the world that they have learned how to make peace happen. Rather, what I mean is that they have suffered greatly, and somehow through that, Jesus has endured with them and carried them through to a place where they feel that sense of freedom even when they're in bondage to something. It might be a body that is failing. It might be a job that is, difficult. Whatever it is, they've gotten to this place where they can feel that sense of peace and grace and freedom, not because they worked it out, but because they have endured and they still have faith, hope, and love that Jesus brings them. And when I see people like that, I think, I want what they have. Which brings me to a conversation about evangelism. Every time I've interviewed with a call committee at a church or practice interviewed with the church where I was helping them through their call thing, somebody always asks, Pastor, what's your strategy for evangelism? And now there used to be a day where you'd go knock on doors and do all kinds of things. My answer is always the same. I don't have one. But what I know to be true is that if we're not super excited to be here and we don't have something like Paul has that we want everyone else to have, people aren't going to be here, right? If we aren't filled up with joy and faith and so just longing to be in this place of grace and love and all the rest of it, why would anybody else come? At our early service, somebody said a prayer during the prayers that lamented that a lot of our younger people aren't in church. And you think, right, they haven't seen us and said, I want what they have. They went on to say that, online churches allowed people to connect to us in new ways, and maybe our message gets out there. The thing is, we can't market the gospel, right? We are called to witness to the resurrection. We are called to tell our stories. We are called to share the hope that is within us, but that is not marketing. Paul is telling us what the program of evangelism is, and it's to follow Jesus, to imitate Paul and other people that walk that road. And that imitating Paul and walking that road is not about success. It's not about the bottom line. It's not about numbers. It's not about anything except death and resurrection. Paul's writing from jail. He's lost it all, right? And yet, he still feels free. So it's an invitation for us to follow Jesus and to be obedient, even to the point of death. That's a hard road to walk, but it turns out that it's not about us trying to have what others have or wanting them to have what we have. Paul actually keeps talking and says, Jesus transforms us from our humility into his glory. So who's doing the work? Jesus. And Paul says that Jesus has the power to make all things subject to him. That means everything, the whole thing, right? Jesus came to reconcile the whole creation to God, and he has the power to make that happen. Which means, as much as there are people that I look at who have faith and I want what they have, and as much as Paul invites us to want what he has, ultimately, he's telling us that God has us. It's that God has us that makes all the difference in the world. It's that Jesus transforms us that puts us in that place where people might look at us and say, I want what they have. So what that does for us today, it takes all of the pressure off. It takes all of the stress out of how is it that we be the church. We don't have to come up with a great grand strategy. It's just walk the way of Jesus in the world and trust that as we walk the way of Jesus in the world, he has us. And that when we go out into the world with grace and mercy and faith and joy and all the gifts that we have been given, other people will look and say, gosh, I really want what they have. Even as we're looking at Paul and saying, I want what he has, but ultimately it's Jesus that has us all, and that makes all the difference in the world. Amen.